reason I asked that, Ellen called me tonight, and she just started to ask me if I knew about her grandson. She says, "Oh, I'll have to call you back." And I don't know whether she got.
He's off the respirator, but still in ICU.
What was his problem?
I don't know. But he was unresponsive. But he's some slight improvement, I guess, would be the term. Okay, we're going to be in Genesis 45, and hello, Thelma. Sherry says hello. Kim says hello. Genesis 45, we'll start with the first 8 verses. Then Joseph could not contain himself before all those, or could not control himself before all those who stood by him. And he cried, "Have everyone go out from me." So there was no man with him when Joseph made himself known to his brothers. He wept so loudly that the Egyptians heard it, and the household of Pharaoh heard of it. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "I am Joseph. Is my father still alive?" But his brothers could not answer him, for they were dismayed at his presence. Then Joseph said to his brothers, "Please come closer to me." And they came closer, and he said, "I am your brother Joseph, whom you sold into Egypt. Now do not be grieved or angry with yourselves because you sold me here, for God sent me before you to preserve life. But the famine has been in the land these 2 years, and there are still 5 years in which there will be neither plowing nor harvesting. God sent me before you to preserve for you a remnant in the earth, and to keep you alive by great deliverance. Now therefore it was not you who sent me here, but God. And he has made me a father to Pharaoh, and lord of all his household, and ruler over all the land of Egypt." Any thoughts on our first 8 verses here?
That must have been such a shock. Wow.
It did kind of probably come off the radar, didn't it?
Yeah. I mean, they had no clue.
Something when you see somebody you're not expecting to see somewhere. I was going to college at Harding in Arkansas, and a girl I had known back in middle school in South Texas. And it's not that surprising because I went to church with them, but she ended up going to Harding too. But I hadn't seen her in 10, 12 years or whatever it was, and I couldn't remember her name. I just remembered her as a person more than anything, and it was just stunning to see her there. And that's not nearly as stunning as this must have been for the brothers. So it's been quite a while for Joseph since his brothers sold him into slavery. 7 good years. They've had 2 bad years, so that's 9. And it was, I think, 2 years after the cupbearer went back. So that's 11, and maybe another year or 2 before he got into the jail situation where he met the cupbearer. So 12, 13 years. And you sell someone off into slavery, you probably don't think they're going to live that much longer. And you certainly don't think you're going to see him in a position of power. You're not expecting him certainly to be running the show in Egypt, basically the next Pharaoh. But there he is, and it certainly was an emotional scene for Joseph. And the brothers, once they start to make sense of it all, it can probably is emotional. At first, they're probably just in shock and awe there. So, does anybody else have any thoughts on the first 8 verses?
It's interesting that Joseph said, "But God made me a father to Pharaoh." That's an interesting statement, and I don't really understand the politics of Egypt, but well, I don't know whether Pharaoh was a young man, or whether that's a different type of.
Isn't he like an advisor? It isn't that father figure is like an advisor type thing?
Yeah, it's kind of even more than that. He's directing the steps, basically.
He's an advisor, but
He's been given the whole empire, basically. It's, if you look at, it's like Pharaoh handed him the keys to his brand new Ferrari. You know, it's still titled, registered, and all that in Pharaoh's name, but Joseph's the only one who drives it. I guess it's kind of like on the show Magnum P.I. Remember that, where he's living in the big mansion and he drives the Ferrari around all the time. It's not his, but he makes himself at home there and he acts like it's his. Well, Joseph is running the show, making these decisions, running Egypt. He is basically Pharaoh. He is almost. It's one of those situations where, kind of politically or legally or whatever, Pharaoh could at any time exert his authority and retake and do whatever he wanted, have Joseph killed if he wanted to. But that's not the practical day-to-day reality, and Pharaoh likes it this way. He doesn't have to do anything. So he's got it made, and he's not going to he's not going to rock that boat. Any other thoughts on this?
There's got to be, I mean, there's confusion, but there's got to be a little bit of them that's just really terrified, this whole thing, going kind of how he's kind of played them in a way with putting money in their sacks and all this stuff, and just totally knowing now that there is a good reason for him to be very angry. So it's, what it's about, what's taking place here is a complete from one end to the other, where they've got to be terrified and then realizing that they're being shown mercy.
Well, it's a good point because most of us have heard the story or read the story several times during the course of our lives, and we can lose sight as we go through the story of the element of surprise, the element of Joseph has really done very little up to this point to indicate things are going to end well for the brothers. The manipulation has been basically to get Benjamin in his presence. That's what he's done. And some expression of concern for his fathers. He's had Simeon incarcerated, so it's not been obvious to them. And they are blinded at the same time, blinded by their guilt. And we'll see that later on. This is what I think you can say is thorough reconciliation, but still imperfect reconciliation. Not because Joseph is not willing to forgive and to reconcile with his brothers, but because the guilt the brothers have associated with their betrayal of Joseph is something that they have to live with. It's something that still causes fear in their, no matter what Joseph says. If you go up to someone who's really grieving or crying and you say, "Don't cry," that may or may not stop the tears, Don't worry about it. It's okay. They'll decide really if it's okay. So their part in his betrayal haunts them even going forward, even after they come down to Egypt. We'll see that in the future. They still have fear. So finding out that it's Joseph doesn't make everything okay for them. It can make it terrifyingly worse, actually, yes. I mean, if my little brother could have had this kind of power over me at some point, I would have been in big trouble. So any other thoughts? It's a very theologically rich 8 verses. This
He's
is
talking about coming before them to do God's work, basically. So I gathered from that. That was pretty, and then he has, he's forgiving as well.
there's of course forgiveness going along that leads to the reconciliation. It can't really be reconciliation unless there is forgiveness. But it is the word about God in this that Joseph has is how Joseph comprehends what has happened to him up to that point, how he sees the events at play. And one thing I think, in our contemporary society are not good at is balancing things. We are very one way or the other, and we tend to be extreme one way or the other, go way far in one direction and then come swinging back in the other direction sometimes. And God is maybe understood in those terms ourselves sometimes, but really God is a God of balance, and he's always balancing things. He knows each one of us, and yet he is the God of all of us, the God of the universe. His eye is on the sparrow, and yet he created an incomprehensibly big, for our way of thinking, an infinite universe. So he knows both the eternal purposes he has in mind, and yet he has our personal cares and concerns laid before him. He knows about Wally, where he's at right now, and yet he knows what he's going to be doing if the earth is still in existence, if he does not send Jesus in return, for the next 1,000 years. Our lives are vapors, but they're very important vapors to us, aren't they? It's the only vapors we got. And sometimes I give Sherry the vapors, I think. But it's this balancing act. And Joseph looks at what God has done and describes it as, he looks at what has happened to him and he describes it as something God has done. And that's real challenging. Hello, Mindy, and hello, Ann. Good to have, and Darius, glad to have you all here. We've talked about it a little bit, but Joseph says, God sent me here to Egypt ahead of you to preserve life. How did Joseph get to Egypt?
He was sold there by his brothers.
He was kidnapped
He was kidnapped.
by his brothers with the intent to murder him. They came upon a plan to, I guess, make a little money out of the deal at the same time. Why kill him? We don't have anything. We sell him. We got money. Sell him, and then he ends up in Egypt. And in Egypt, he starts out as a household servant for Potiphar, soon becomes the head of Potiphar's household, takes over, runs everything. He's falsely accused of trying to have sex with Potiphar's wife, loses his status there, goes into prison, goes down. It's from favored son of a rich man to slave to prisoner. The slave to prisoner drop isn't maybe as big as the drop he's already had, but it's still a drop. But then soon he's running the prison, basically. And then he has the cupbearer and the baker come into his custody. He takes care of them, and that's the beginning of his path out.
He must have a great organization.
Well, does God work through kidnapping, intention to murder? Does he make people do that? Were the brothers doing God's will by kidnapping and selling their brother into slavery?
No, but I think God made it work. I can't imagine that God said, you're going to kidnap your brother, sell him to the Ishmaelites. He's going to Egypt, end up as a slave. And it's all part of my plan. But, maybe it is, but I think maybe he said, well, that happened, so now I got to do this.
What do you think, Mr. Kelso? Did you have your hand up?
Yeah. I think it was God working with the evil criminal things that were happening. But definitely he's working in making a positive out of those negative things.
That's how it works sometimes.
Remember that kidnapping was a capital offense under the Mosaic Law. So they weren't under the Mosaic Law yet, But the first readers of the story would have been under the Mosaic law, and they would have said the brothers deserve to be put to death. Even though they didn't kill Joseph, what they did was in a sense, they did kill Joseph. And a way of looking at this, and we'll see it kind of unfold, I think, is Joseph is dead to his father, to the one who really loves him, to maybe the only one who really loves him, his father. Joseph is dead. The coat of many colors that Dolly Parton sang about, that gets brought in to Jacob, and it's got blood on it, and there's a lot of deception. There's not just violence, there's deception, there's exploitation. Joseph gets put in these situations where he's incredibly vulnerable. Of course, slaves are very vulnerable. Even if they're running the household, they're vulnerable. He's vulnerable to the lady of the house, as is shown in the story. And then prisoners, they are very vulnerable. I was, when I was at the ER today, there was an inmate there getting some treatment as well. He's getting treated in his orange jumpsuit, and his hands are cuffed while he's getting treated. It's no fun being in the ER. And now you're in there in your prison clothes and your handcuffs. That's just, it's just really, very vulnerable. He may be guilty of some horrible crime. I don't know. They had 2 police officers there watching him. He may be totally innocent, wrongfully accused of, I don't know. But it's no fun being in the ER, is it? Well, being in there as a prisoner. So he's being made vulnerable and exploited by people. This isn't God's way of working. This isn't what God does. But God can take those actions, and we kind of hinted about that already, and he redeems them. This is God's redemptive power on display. And then when Joseph says, God sent me, he's not saying it as a factual assertion that God wanted you to kidnap me, but he is saying that God made all things work together for good for someone who loves him. He didn't make all things, but he made them all work together for good. And when Jesus came to earth, we look at it now and we see God's purpose in everything, even the torture and crucifixion. We see God's purposes. But that doesn't mean God wanted them to do that. And how wonderful would it have been if Jesus had come to earth and people heard his message of love and peace. And we're studying the Gospel of Luke on Sunday mornings once a month. Luke, that's one of Jesus' most overriding messages, is seek peace. Do not rebel against Rome. Dwell in peace with your neighbors, even the Romans. What if people had heard his message and responded with love, responded with peace, responded with repentance, authentic repentance? Could God's will not have been accomplished that way? That's exactly what God wanted, wasn't it? He doesn't want anyone to perish. He doesn't want his son to perish. He wants everyone to repent, everyone to be reconciled to him. But God can take the most evil thing we can do, which is kill his son, and bring about our redemption through that, our forgiveness, our reconciliation to him. And the story of Joseph and like a lot of Old Testament characters, you can find parallels between Joseph and Jesus. And you could certainly find parallels there. Joseph is effectively dead to the Father and is now going to be, in a sense, resurrected. He is going to be returned to his father, and that's going to, his father is going to find out he's alive. That the son which is dead is now alive. You could tell his brothers, your brother who is dead is now alive. So this is a really theologically rich statement and story for those who are enduring suffering and those who have come through suffering, those who have come out on the other side of it. And you go back and you look at it, and it gives us permission, without placing blame at God, at God's feet, without saying to him, it's your fault I endured all this. But we can still say, God sent me through this because he has a purpose. And the purpose, in this case, sometimes you suffer and you never figure out the purpose. You never learn it. It's never made evident to you. Maybe you don't survive it physically. So in your earthly life, you never know the reason. I saw a quote the other day. There is no success without sacrifice. If you're succeeding without sacrifice, then someone else made the sacrifice. And if you're sacrificing without success, someone else may experience the success. So there's always sacrifice when there is success. So you may not see what's happening. You may not. Our purposes, our lives, again, are short and narrow. But God is concerned. He hasn't forgotten Joseph. He hasn't forgotten the plight that he's in. But God has this sweeping, eternal purpose. And God's purpose is what he swore to Abraham. Through your seed, all nations of the earth will be blessed. And what Joseph has done and what we can do, I think, as we go through suffering, is we can focus narrowly on our own situation and then kind of build out and extrapolate from that. Now, the extrapolation isn't going to be perfect, but it's another balancing act. It's a narrowing and a broadening. God starts out with one man, Abraham, a man who cannot have children because his wife is barren. From him, he brings a big family. Jacob has 12 sons. Abraham's grandson has 12 sons. And that big family is ultimately going to be a nation that is going to bless other nations, all other nations. To be that blessing, to become the nation that can bless other nations, they have to be distinctive. If they just intermarry, they stay in the land of Canaan. And that's another thing. All this is happening. God is bringing life to the family of faith by taking them out of the land of promise. The life at that point was not in Canaan. It was not in the land of promise. They had to be removed from the land of Canaan. They become from a family, they become a nation while they're in Egypt. And then they go back and they conquer the land, and that's it's complicated because there's a lot of bloodshed and there's a lot of violence, and God orders it. So all of these platitudes about God being kind of a sunshine gumball rainbow God. I mean, there's some really hard things to deal with God doing in the conquest. I'm not going to try to resolve all that tonight, but his purpose is ultimately to create a nation in Israel that can bless all other nations. And Joseph is one person, but he plays a big part in that purpose being accomplished. So it starts with one family. It becomes a nation that blesses the world. It blesses the world ultimately and fully and finally in bringing one person back into the world, in bringing Jesus into the world. And that one person starts a big spiritual family. There's 12 disciples. And then they start the church, which is a peculiar people, a distinct nation, whose purpose is to go into the world and be a blessing to the world, making disciples out of everyone and teaching them to obey the commandments of God and await the return of Jesus Christ. So it's a cycle and it repeats itself. Abraham to Israel, to Jesus, the church, and then ultimately we anticipate the return of Jesus Christ. So this is a parallel story. It's not exactly the same. but a parallel story. Unlikely births, strife, resistance, movement. None of this is happening while everybody's just sitting at home watching Columbo reruns, which is probably what you'd like to be doing right now, huh? Sitting and watching One More Thing. It's a funny show. I understand that. But this is the greatness of God's purposes. He has these eternal purposes for humanity, for creation, and yet he is mindful of each individual. They have a role in that. But God's timing is God's timing. And sometimes when we don't get what we want, when we want it, when we think we need it, it may not be that God is not going to give it to us. It may be that God is not going to give it to us, but it may not be that God is not going to give it to us. He may be waiting for a time and a place to act in a way that blesses not only us, but a lot of other people, that accomplishes a broader purpose than we can possibly imagine. And Joseph sees that now. He looks at everything he went through and can now see that God was working with it all and bringing about his will. I don't know, at some point when we have probably more than one class going at a time, we'll look at the different major theologies of the Old Testament, the different ways Israel comprehended God, what they thought about God. And my personal favorite one, which is not one of the major ones, but kind of really a minor one, is the idea of remnant theology. And in remnant, God takes the leftovers. He takes maybe the survivors of a Holocaust or a genocide. He takes just what barely made it through and then brings that right back and grows it up out of them. And I think that's a really important Old Testament theology for the church, because we go through these times of difficulty, these times of persecution, where we get kind of pruned back, where we get burnt off. And we think it's all over. Nothing good could come out. It's kind of like Elijah was saying, only I am left, when he wasn't the only one left, but he thought he was. And God takes that little remnant and look at the tree he can grow from that. The parable, there's a couple of parables or statements about mustard seeds by Jesus. One is your faith just needs to be the size of a mustard seed to move mountains. Another one is faith is like a mustard seed. When planted in a garden, it becomes basically a tree. It's a plant, but it's not really a tree, but technically, but it's in their context, it's a tree. It's bigger than everything else. And then what happens with that tree? All the birds come live in that tree in the middle of a garden. I know we have at least one gardener here. I don't know we have multiple. I guys got two gardeners here, maybe more. Do you want birds in your garden? No. Do you want birds in your cornfield? You put up the scarecrow to keep the birds away, don't you? But it's not your garden. It's God's garden. And God is okay with the birds being in the garden. He planted a tree for them to live in. So out of small things, God can make great things. And when he does, he gets all the credit, honor, and glory. And when men do things they think on their own, those things will not endure. They didn't really do it on their own. That's the thing. Nobody gets wherever they go in life all on their own. If you think you did, you're wrong. You got help. It doesn't make you independent, self-sufficient. It makes you ungrateful to think it that way. I'm going to quit picking on him eventually, but there's a guy in Seattle. He's lost tens of billions of dollars by his personal behavior. It's okay, it's going to his wife, but he's lost it. He's lost billions. I would never lose billions of dollars. I can promise you that. You'll never say, well, Rick just blew $50 billion. Rick can kiss that $50 billion goodbye. You'll never say that. I promise. Let's see. Marlene says hello. Hello, Marlene. So, how we comprehend these things and how we talk about them is important too. If we do talk about them too simplistically, if we just say, almost like Joseph said, that God did all this, it does give occasion to our enemies to kind of mock us, to think that we're so simplistic, and to show that this type of view is inconsistent with other views of God. But again, they are looking at an extreme view of God, and we may be looking at a different extreme view of God, and God is found not contained within the middle, but over all of these things. He's not just what you think he is. He's not just what I think he is. He is infinite. And at times, he does not want the brothers to act this way, but their sin is not going to defeat his purpose. Joseph has the dream. That's the beginning of the Joseph narrative. Joseph has the dream. Everybody, my family, everybody, the stars and the moon, they're all going to bow down to me. That's the dream. And he didn't have to go around telling everybody. Again, my mom said, you don't have to tell everything you know. Sometimes you can hold on to some of that information. But he did tell everybody, and they hated him for it. Even Jacob is upset with him. But that God had revealed his purposes for Joseph to him, and the sin of his brothers is not going to defeat God's purposes. If the sin of us killing his son does not defeat his purpose of reconciling us to him through his son, then no sin of ours is going to defeat God's purpose. So the Joseph story, has all this going on. Again, there's a lot of parallels with Christ. All this is moving, and sometimes you do get these moments, this kind of, I guess, from an epiphany, a moment of clarity where, all the colors of the Rubik's Cube line up exactly like they're supposed to. I could never solve one of those things if my life depended on it, but at some point, things kind of become clear and things fall into place and we understand them for a minute. Sometimes they don't. Okay, let's move on. Whatever happens, we're done with 45 tonight because 1 through 8 is really the heart of the chapter. Let's look at 9 through 15. Hurry up. Joseph is still talking to his brothers. Hurry up and go to my father and say to him, thus says your son Joseph, God has made me Lord of all Egypt. Come down to me, do not delay. You shall live in the land of Goshen, and you shall be near me, and you and your children, and your children's children, and your flocks, and your herds, and all that you have. There I will provide for you, for there are still 5 years of famine to come, and you and your household and all that you have would be impoverished. Behold, your eyes see, and the eyes of my brother Benjamin see, that it is my mouth which is speaking to you. Now you must tell my father of all my splendor in Egypt, and all that you have seen, and you must hurry and bring my father down here. Then he fell on his brother Benjamin's neck and wept, and Benjamin wept on his neck. He kissed all his brothers and wept on them, and afterward his brothers talked with him. Okay. So this resurrected Joseph now appears to his brothers. What does Jesus tell Mary at his resurrection? Go and tell my brothers. He's telling his brothers, go and tell my father that I'm alive and come to me. And I can take care of you, and I will provide you. I will give you rest unto your soul. The famine is a long way from being over. So he gives his brothers a message for his father and a mission. Go and bring him back. He equips them for their work. Here are the wagons. Here is food and money. We'll look at that maybe here in a little bit. But this resurrected Joseph, just as Jesus has a mission, the resurrected Jesus has a mission for his disciples. Joseph has a mission for his brothers. Go and tell my father, go bring them back here, dwell here in Egypt. And we're not going to read it. We're running a little bit short of time. But verses 16 through 28, again, this kind of continues to unfold. And God has another balancing act. Pharaoh, we've already seen the household of Pharaoh is aware of what is happening. They've heard Joseph's wailing, his crying out, his lamenting. They've heard that. Now they know the story. And Egypt, the empire, the Pharaoh says, do this. Now, God moves the empire on behalf of a family. And a family staring at ruin, a family staring at impoverishment, starvation, total destruction, total annihilation, oblivion, is now going to, according to Pharaoh, come to Egypt and eat the fat of the land. Have the best of everything. We'll give you the best land. You know, you're going to have it really good. Come down here. And they send wagons. They don't have to walk back and forth. They don't have to carry, drag, whatever. They can load up the wagons and come that way. They're removing all impediments between Jacob staying at home and Jacob coming down there. I think if I was Joseph, I might have just kept Benjamin. That might have been the best inducement. You want to see Joseph and Benjamin, you got to come to Egypt. They're both there waiting on you. But they send all these things to Jacob. They send him food, clothing, wealth, provision, every reason to come back to Egypt. And we'll read. Let's pick up. We'll read verse 24 through the close of the chapter. So he sent his brothers away, and as they departed, he said to them, "Do not quarrel on the journey." Then they went up from Egypt and came to the land of Canaan, to their father Jacob. They told him, saying, "Joseph is still alive, and indeed he is ruler over all the land of Egypt." But he was stunned, for he did not believe them. When they told him all the words of Joseph that he had spoken to them, and when he saw, the wagons Joseph had sent them to carry him, the spirit of their father Jacob revived. Then Israel said, "It is enough. My son Joseph is still alive. I will go and see him before I die." So this resurrection of Joseph, it begins with message and with mission, and it brings about new life. Where there was the prospect of death, now there is life. Jacob is, in a sense, dead in himself. He's dead because he's in such deep grief for his son Jacob and son Joseph, and perhaps he's given up on Benjamin. And he's certainly concerned for the welfare of Benjamin. The resurrection of Joseph, the symbolic resurrection of Joseph, has given life. The spirit of Jacob is revived. Jacob was down, maybe in the nursing home, sitting around waiting to die. And then something good happens. And then Joseph is resurrected. And now he's ready to live again. He's gotten purpose too. Okay, I'm about to sneeze, so we're going to call it a night. Thank you for your thoughts and comments.